Hello and welcome to another fantastic edition of VU Sports Wired. I'm Cutler Klein alongside Max Schneider and Drew Sundaram. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. We have an action-packed show for you today. We've got some breaking news into the VU Sports Wired studio that we'll get to in just a second. We'll also have some baseball talk and full breakdowns of our NCAA tournament brackets. Vanderbilt, of course, not in the tournament this year, but you know, it's still fun to break down some bracketology here in the VU Sports Wired studio. First, our breaking news just a few moments ago. We learned from Adam Sparks of the Tennessean that Peyton Willis and Larry Austin Jr. from the Vanderbilt basketball team have been granted their release to transfer out of Vanderbilt. Comes as a little bit of a surprise in some aspects of it, but an important aspect of this is that it does free up a couple of scholarships for a potentially star-studded recruiting class. Guys, your initial thoughts on this news?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a shock, and Peyton Willis is somebody who, even with the incoming players, still figured to be a big part of this program next year. Austin, not as much, and I think the move with Larry Austin makes a lot of sense. He's a guy that is a grad transfer now, and so he doesn't have to sit out a year no matter where he goes. He likely was going to fall completely out of the rotation next year. That move makes a lot of sense, and when you look at it, Vandy has such an overhaul with this roster next year. You look at the recruits they have, obviously Garland, Shittu, Neesmith, possibly Langford, and also possibly power forward, five-star power forward E.J. Montgomery, who decommitted from Auburn a few weeks ago. So with the potential of these two new recruits, the three they already had, Matt Ryan, Yanni Wetzel transferring, there's just so many spots up for grabs now, and Willis definitely saw what could have been a dip in his playing time and likely would have been a dip in his playing time, and the move makes a lot of sense. Vandy did have to clear a spot for Romeo Langford, and if they wanted to pursue E.J. Montgomery, which we're told they are pursuing E.J. Montgomery says he talks to the coaches every day, then they needed to clear up another spot. And so this is probably the best of both worlds for both the team and these two guys to get minutes elsewhere and also be able to secure these recruits going forward.
Right, when we heard this news, we were all here in the studio, and it was very surprising at first because none of us saw this coming. But then when you're actually thinking about it, it does make a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense, especially when you're thinking about this new-look Commodore team that's starting to come to fruition, and we're really starting to see it take shape. Historically, the Commodore basketball team has been a team that's very dependent on shooting threes. But now we see that the crux of this team is going to be really focused on true point guards and a lot of cutting to the basket and maybe some genuine pick-and-roll action. And that's the really exciting part, and that's where it makes sense when you see these players departing. Because especially when you have Darius Garland, true point guard, Saban Lee, who some of his best plays came on cuts to the basket and crashing the board, you see this new team coming to fruition. And I think it's really, really interesting because the entire last season seemed like we had an eye on the future. And it was tough because there were a lot of hallmarks and there were a lot of bright spots, but it was very much looking towards the future and trying to see what this team's going to be like. And I think that these transfer moves really are focusing on what the new look of the Commodores are going to be and how it's basically going to be a completely different team with a different mindset.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Larry Austin Jr. transferring is not that surprising because you saw his role diminish as the season went on. He came in as a pretty highly touted grad transfer, or just transfer in general. He didn't quite live up to the expectations. Peyton Willis, I thought, could have been an integral part of the guard core for this upcoming season. And he looked good this season once he recovered from an early injury. But, you know, when you have that much talent coming in, clearly they saw the writing on the wall and wanted to be able to have the chance to play elsewhere. And all the power to them. I think for Vanderbilt, you mentioned, this is just a nice break for them to be able to clear out the space to be able to get these two guys. Now, is this a sign that they think they're going to get those guys? I don't quite think so. I think this is more of just giving them the opportunity to do it kind of thing. I'll let you get your thoughts on that because I think this is, it's a marriage of convenience in some way for these two, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't say that this is a sign that Vanderbilt's going to get Romeo Langford, but Peyton Willis knows what's going on. He knows that Romeo Langford is highly considering Vanderbilt and probably doesn't want to be in that position should he commit. And so for Willis, I mean, again, the move makes a lot of sense. A place that I think that he might go is Arkansas, and we don't know anything about his offers, who he's talked to, anything like that. He's from Fayetteville, though. Arkansas has 3 excellent senior guards that are all graduating this season, and Willis might be able to step into that rotation there. So we don't know what's going to happen with Willis, where he's going to go, But I do think that this was more of a precursor to Langford maybe coming to Vanderbilt. I don't think that the staff knows anything that we don't in terms of Langford committing. He certainly has kept his mouth shut on that front.
Right, by no means is this a guarantee, but I think it's definitely better to be prepared for something like that than have to scramble and try and accommodate last second. And especially when you're looking at style play and Peyton Willis's fit on the team. Just a few weeks ago, we were talking about a potential three-guard system, but Peyton Willis really has been more of a pick-and-pop type of player than more of a pick-and-roll, cut-to-the-basket type of player. So especially when you're looking at this new true point guard heavy look for the team, I think it just makes sense.
Of course, Peyton Willis being an underclassman will have to sit out a year and is transferring unless the NCAA grants him a special exception. Larry Austin would be potentially a grad transfer because he's graduating this May, so he'll be able to play right away wherever he goes. So that's something to keep an eye on wherever these players go. Moving on from the hardwood to the hard bats on the baseball field, the Vanderbilt Commodores are rolling. The Vandy boys took a few games out west in California as well as in Texas, beat some highly touted teams such as Houston, UCLA, and TCU in front of a crowd at Dodger Stadium. Guys, this is a team that we knew they were good based on the way they played against some lower-level competition at home early on. Then they go on the road. They had some bumps. They lost one of their games at Minute Maid Park in Houston. They lost a tough game against Long Beach State. So, they got some good wins against some really quality opponents. What does that say about the way this team is trending?
I think this is huge. I think especially going into SEC play, these really quality wins are something that this team can really hang their hat on and something that they can go into actual conference play with a lot of confidence. And when you look at their results from the Classic over the weekend, I think there's some really good things to take away. Because not only did they beat a number 8 ranked TCU and a number 11 ranked UCLA, the way they did it was very impressive because there was a real focus and a real emphasis placed on pitching. I mean, they held UCLA and TCU to a combined .237 batting average. And even against Long Beach State, which they eventually lost to, they still had 6 scoreless innings before a flurry of runs in a single inning is what pushed them over the edge. And we've seen this pitching really come into its own. And when you're looking at the bullpen last year, that was a really big concern. And the fact that the pitching's doing really well this year, and the fact that they've had a lot of freshman production, I think that there's a lot of really good things that the Commodores have momentum going into SEC play with.
Yeah, this is enormous, and the difference between this year and last year on the schedule of non-conference play, and last year non-conference play was a huge point of emphasis, and Vanderbilt lost a lot of those games to teams that they shouldn't have lost to. Now, not only are Vanderbilt, is this team not losing those games, of course, started the season 9-1, beating these teams at home, but they're beating teams that they probably shouldn't even be beating with this young core this early in their careers. I mean, when you have a group of freshmen and you put 4 or 5 freshmen in a lineup, throw a freshman on the mound, and you're going out all the way out west to face a UCLA team that's experienced and has been there, and a TCU, a team that's not too removed from a College World Series run as well. These aren't games that you expect to win, and the fact that Vanderbilt's been able to win these games is a testament to how ready and how mature these freshmen really are. But as great as the freshmen have been, Drake Fellows has been excellent for this team. He's been, I think, the most important player on this team so far. You came into the season expecting kind of Patrick Raby to be the ace. And he has been in the innings that he's thrown, but he's been dealing with a foot injury. He looks like he's just ready to come back from that. Drake Fellows has taken the ball on every Friday, and he's been nearly perfect. Everything they can ask for. Has a 2.42 ERA, opposing batting average of 187. And when we looked at Drake Fellows last year, the problem was his command a little bit. And we saw he would get into funks where he would walk 4 or 5 batters in a game and kind of spiral out of control. This year, 7 walks in 4 starts. And his control is really there. He has an excellent command of his fastball. He's showing that he's a little more than just a power pitcher. And so I've been extremely impressed with what Drake Fellows has been able to do. And if you combine him with Patrick Raby going forward, maybe Jake Eater, Chandler Day, Mason Hickman at Sundays at the back half of that rotation, you might have a really, really legitimate top pitching staff going forward.
I mean, last year, you mentioned what was going on with non-conference play last year. It was bad. They lost series that they definitely should have won. They lost games that they definitely should have won. This year, it's a slightly different story. What's made the difference between last year and this year? You can obviously point to the bullpen and pitching depth. What are some things that have made the difference between non-conference play last year and this year?
I really do think that it's got to be the freshman influence on this team. And the freshmen were a big question mark coming into the season. #1 recruiting class is something you heard a lot about, but this is also a team that didn't have a ton of veteran leadership. So the fact that the freshmen have been able to step up the way they have, and it's not just one or two freshmen, it's across the board. I mean, when you're looking at the Classic Series over the weekend, Jason Gonzalez had 5 RBIs, and that really helped lift them over UCLA and TCU. So I think the way that the freshmen across the board have been able to step up and help has been huge.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of these games, when this lineup's putting up 15 runs, in large part to the credit of the freshmen, I mean, you're going to beat any team putting up that many runs. But something that's been extremely impressive is late in these games, the bullpen, that Tim Corbin's sticking with some of these guys. And last year, we'd see he wouldn't have as much faith in that bullpen, especially those younger guys. They'd give up a couple runs, he'd take them out. He wouldn't let these guys get in too much of a rhythm. This year, he's done an excellent job at keeping guys in for multiple innings out of the bullpen. And we saw that with Mason Hickman early on against Duke that first weekend, threw 5 innings out of the bullpen. That's incredible for a freshman in his first start. Tyler Brown routinely throws 2-3 innings out of the bullpen, letting these guys get into a rhythm, go through the entire lineup at least once, and that's really given these guys a chance to mature and be better going forward.
We'll see how this team fares going into SEC play. And now, for the most special, most important part of the show, it's time for our bracket breakdown. Each of us has filled out a ESPN NCAA Tournament bracket. We are here to break it down region by region. We're going to start with Max's bracket. Let's see what he has to say.
All right, when you look at the South region, this region's all about Virginia and obviously no problems in the first round. I have Kansas State over Creighton starting in this first round. I really like the way that Kansas State played in the tournament. I know they were missing Dean Wade and Barry Brown later on in this tournament, but I think it gave some of these role players a chance to kind of elevate and be those stars going forward, and I think that's going to be huge having that depth later on in the tournament. I don't have any upsets here. I have Kentucky. I have Arizona. I think those teams just have too much strength. I know the Loyola Chicago is a trendy upset pick. I like Miami. I think this team has a bevy of guards, especially Chris Likes, who's come along late. A much shorter guard, but he's been able to get into the mix of things. I really like Miami. Tennessee, Nevada. I love Nevada this year. Unfortunately, they run into a tough Cincinnati team in the second round, but Nevada's a team composed mostly of transfers. Caleb and Cody Martin. Caleb Martin is the conference player of the year. Cody Martin, the defensive player in the year in the conference. Those guys do everything for Nevada, but Cincinnati in the second round, I like them over Nevada. Moving back to the top, UVA over Kansas State. I think this defense is just too good to lose this early in the tournament. I have Kentucky, Arizona, and I know this is a matchup that looks like it might be a little more of an Elite Eight kind of matchup, but they do have to meet early on. I know Coach Calipari always says his team has the toughest draws of all. I think Kentucky's really playing their best basketball right now. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Kevin Knox really do it all for this team. Gilgeous-Alexander has come on extremely well as of late. He wasn't a starter to begin this season, but at 6'6", he's learning his shot a little bit more, plays excellent perimeter defense, gets to the basket and gets to the line very well. Both of those guys should be first-round draft picks when the NBA draft comes this May. Then I have Tennessee over Miami. I know an unpopular pick, of course, for this show because no one wants Tennessee to win these games, but Tennessee is extremely strong in their front court. We saw Admiral Schofield really put on a show against Kentucky. Him and Grant Williams get the job done against Miami. And then, as I said before, Cincinnati over Nevada. This is the best team that Mick Cronin's had here in Cincinnati. I know the defense has always been the calling card for this team. It's no different this year. But this year, they have an offense to match, and that's been the problem for Cincinnati in the past. They haven't been able to have that tournament success. This year, the Bearcats have that offense in Gary Clark. Name any award in the American Conference, and Gary Clark won it. Conference Player of the Year, Conference Defensive Player of the Year, Conference Tournament MVP, even won the Sportsmanship Award in the conference. Gary Clark does everything for the Cincinnati team. I see them advancing. Then moving back to the top of the conference, this was a tough matchup for me, and a lot of people have UVA skating by easily. I think this is a really close game, and in large part because Virginia lost DeAndre Hunter yesterday to a broken wrist, and he's the kind of guy who on defense, he's that wing that can guard guys like Kevin Knox, guys like Wenyen Gabriel out on the perimeter. Now they don't have that anymore. I still think Virginia gets past Kentucky with the shooting of Kyle Guy and Ty Jerome. I think it's tough to score on this Kentucky defense, but with excellent perimeter shooting like Virginia has, they should be able to get the job done. And then I have Cincinnati over Tennessee. Like I said, Cincinnati, too much defense for Tennessee. They swarm you down in the post. Grant Williams, I know he's the SEC Player of the Year. I don't know if he'll be able to have that typical kind of Grant Williams game against the combination of Gary Clark and Kyle Washington down low. So I have Tennessee losing to Cincinnati. I have UVA taking on Cincinnati in the Elite Eight. And I have Virginia moving on to the Final Four. Virginia just has no weaknesses, and this is something we've seen all year, kind of waiting for Virginia to lose one of these games. But 31-2 under this program, this is the best team that Tony Bennett's coached. Obviously, he's a guy who prides on hustle, on defense, on three-point shooting, and he always has the personnel to do that. I think he might be the best coach in college basketball, and I know a lot of people think Krzyzewski and Coach Calipari. I think Tony Bennett is the best coach in college basketball. He should be the coach of the year this year, and that's why you have Virginia moving into the Final Four out of the South region. All right, in the West, first round, I have Xavier, Missouri. I like South Dakota State over Ohio State in this region. South Dakota State, obviously, with Mike Dahm, they finally have the second option in David Jenkins Jr. to get the job done. I see them winning this first-round matchup. I like Gonzaga. Houston's hot right now, but San Diego State might be even hotter, coming off a 9-game win streak. Every team that has beaten San Diego State in conference, they have since beaten them. They're playing their best basketball right now. I like Michigan to advance. Providence over Texas A&M, and then UNC. I like Xavier over Missouri in this second-round matchup, Gonzaga over South Dakota State. I like Michigan to beat San Diego State, and here's my big upset pick for the entire bracket, really. I like Providence over UNC. Ed Cooley has his guys playing hot at the right time. They're ready to run through a brick wall for him. This is a senior point guard in Kyron Cartwright who's been here before. He's been in these big games. This team can rebound with UNC, and that's really how you beat North Carolina, staying with them on the glass. They can defend. I think North Carolina is a little bit overseeded as a 2 seed with 10 losses. I think that was a little bit of a flaw on the part of the committee. I see Providence getting past there. Then Xavier Gonzaga, I love the Zags this year. Obviously last year, a run to the finals. They have the potential to do that again. This offense is younger and it's more athletic than it is last year with Jonathan Williams and Killian Tilly down low in the post. Tilly shot 13 of 14 from 3 in the WAC conference tournament. Obviously, he's a guy that can stroke from deep. And then I like Michigan to beat Providence. And then I have Gonzaga over Michigan. I know Michigan's one of the hottest teams in the country right now, having that big win over Michigan State and then another big win over Purdue to win the Big Ten. I just love the offense of Gonzaga right now. I think they have that veteran leadership at point guard with Perkins, like I said, Tilly and Williams down low. I think this is a team that can make a run, and I see them getting to the Final Four out of the West. Out of the East, I think this region is all Villanova. They have a pretty easy draw in this region. I see them getting past, but first they got to take on Alabama and Colin Sexton. He's been hot lately. West Virginia, I really like Murray State, but Javon Carter, I don't see him losing in the first weekend. He's too good as a point guard and on the defensive end. I like Wichita State to beat Marshall. I know I originally put Florida. This is a late change to my bracket after watching St. Bonaventure last night. This is a team that can keep up with Florida in the backcourt. Florida has one of the best backcourts in the country. I think St. Bonaventure also does with the combination of Jalen Adams and Matt Mobley. This is a team that, after winning that game against UCLA, I see them advancing to the second weekend. Another big upset, Stephen F. Austin over Texas Tech. Wasn't too long ago that Stephen F. Austin beat another Big 12 team in a 14-3 matchup, and just 2 years ago. And the way they did that, forcing turnovers. Texas Tech had trouble against a team that forced turnovers this year in West Virginia. Stephen F. Austin forces the most turnovers in the country. I see them being able to get past Texas Tech. Then I have Arkansas over Butler, Arkansas senior guards. Again, you can see kind of the theme here with that senior guard play, and Purdue. Moving on to the second round, Villanova over Alabama. I think that's just easy for them. They have one of the best players in the country in Jalen Brunson and a surefire NBA lottery pick in Mikal Bridges. I have St. Bonaventure again over Stephen F. Austin. I think it's really tough for these 14 seeds to win 2 games in a row. And then I have Purdue over Arkansas to round out the Sweet 16. Then in the Sweet 16, this is a tough game, and this is perhaps Villanova's toughest challenge on their way to the Final Four in West Virginia, the way West Virginia plays defense. But if you have a guard like Jalen Brunson, a guard who's been there, a guard who can handle the pressure, I think he'll be able to get past this West Virginia team and lead them to the Elite Eight, where they will take on Purdue. St. Bonaventure's run stops here. Purdue has 4 seniors starting for them, and Carson Edwards, a guy who averages 18.5 points. This is a Purdue team that's had trouble in the past in tournaments. I think this is the year where they can get to the Final Four, to the Elite Eight, but they can't get further than that. Villanova just has it all going for them. All 5 of these guys that start for them shoot threes at a very high rate. Everybody in the rotation can shoot threes well. They obviously have the defense, 3-and-D guy in Mikal Bridges, and they have the size to match Isaac Haas and Vince Edwards. In Purdue, I have Villanova in the Final Four out of the East region. Out of the Midwest, I have Kansas in the first round. This is interesting. 538 Sports, as our reporter Simon Gibbs told us the other day, 538 Sports gives this the best chance to be a 16-1 upset in history. Unfortunately, I still don't buy it. I have Kansas getting past Penn. NC State in a close one. I have New Mexico State over Clemson. New Mexico State is a team that can get on the boards, rebound Clemson, of course, without Dante Grantham. I don't know if they'll get past New Mexico State and double-double machine Jamario Jones. I have Charleston beating Auburn. Auburn's really struggling this time of year. This is the worst basketball they've been playing all year. Of course, Anthony McLemore out for the year. He was their best rim protector, one of the best rim protectors in the country. Charleston has 3 guys that average over 17 points a game. I see them getting on, beating Auburn. Then I think Syracuse wins this game against Arizona State. And I know Syracuse is a team that probably does not deserve to be in this tournament. I, for one, think it's a shame they even made it here. But we have this conversation with Syracuse every year where do they belong to be here? Do they not belong to be here? I think they don't. But regardless of how that conversation turns out, they always seem to win a game. I think they'll win 2 here, beating Arizona State and then beating TCU. Then I have Michigan State, Oklahoma. I know Oklahoma's been down on their luck lately, but so has Rhode Island. They're narrowly getting by in these games. I think Trae Young has a vintage performance, beats Rhode Island, and then Duke. Moving on to the second round, I think this is a very close matchup. I don't think Kansas is as good as they have been in years past. They don't have the size in the front court. Udoka Azubuike, obviously their best big man, he shoots 41% from the line. And so teams haven't shied away from intentionally fouling him in situations, although I do think Kansas narrowly gets by here. I have New Mexico State over Charleston there. Then I have Michigan State beating Syracuse. Syracuse's run comes to an end. And I have Duke. Then an obvious, easy matchup, Kansas versus New Mexico State at the top of the bracket. And then this is the toughest matchup in the Sweet 16 for me, Michigan State and Duke. And obviously Duke gets after you on the boards with Marvin Bagley and Wendell Carter. I think Michigan State gets past them, though. They have 2 big men that can combat those guys, the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year and Jaren Jackson. I think Michigan State gets past Duke and then gets past Kansas to cement their spot in the Final Four out of the Midwest region. Then in the Final Four, the first matchup, Gonzaga and Virginia. Gonzaga, one of the better offensive teams in the country. Virginia, one of the better defensive teams in the country. I think the Zags' run ends here, though. Virginia just too potent on defense. Gonzaga hasn't seen anything like this team all season. I think Virginia has the defense to carry them to the championship. And on the other side, Villanova and Michigan State. I still love this Villanova team. They space you out. They shoot the basketball. Guys like Omari Spellman and Eric Paschal will extend guys like Jaren Jackson and Nick Ward to defend on the perimeter somewhere where they're not that comfortable. Give Jalen Brunson and Mikal Bridges driving lanes to the basket. I have Villanova in this game. And then in the championship game, the 2 number 1 overall seeds, Virginia and Villanova. And I know we say defense wins championships, but I'm still going with the Villanova Wildcats this year. I think that injury to DeAndre Hunter is a big factor in this game. They'll struggle to defend the shooters of Villanova without him, and they have that veteran leadership in what may be the best player in the country in Jalen Brunson. I see him as the tournament MVP, putting up a big performance and guiding Villanova to a win for their 2nd championship in 3 years.
For my South region, I had a little bit of a hard time picking a lot of these games because it's such a star-studded region. There are so many different good matchups that can come about in this region, and some of my picks might be a little bit unpopular amongst this Vanderbilt crowd. UVA moving on to the first round, I think, is a pretty easy choice against UMBC. Also have Creighton moving on there. We got Kentucky and Arizona moving on. Some people are riding the Davidson bandwagon for Kentucky. I just don't see it against a very hot Kentucky team. Then you have Arizona moving on, of course. Miami is a 6th seed, also taking them not in an upset bid for Loyola Chicago. I think Miami is a very skilled team. Tennessee moving on to the second round as well. The one upset I do have in this region, I have Texas moving on over Nevada. I think Nevada stumbled a little bit in their conference tournament, which might give them a little bit of some trouble going into this NCAA tournament. Then I also have Cincinnati moving on as the 2 seed. Going into the next round, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I have UVA moving on over Creighton. I think they're too strong defensively. Then I have Kentucky over Arizona. I think Kentucky is a deeper team and the hotter team right now going into this game. Then I have Tennessee moving on over Miami. That might be a little bit unpopular amongst this Commodore-heavy crowd, but I do think Tennessee is a very strong team, making it all the way to the final of the SEC tournament. Then I have Cincinnati moving on over Texas in a pretty easy one. Here in the Sweet 16, it's a little bit tough here. UVA Kentucky should be a barn burner of a game, but I ultimately think that UVA is too strong of a team defensively to be able to lose in that one. I have them moving on. Then here's another upset pick here. I have Tennessee going to the Elite Eight. Yes, those Tennessee Volunteers moving to the Elite Eight over Cincinnati. I like to pick the hot teams in March, and Tennessee is a very hot team right now, despite all that black and gold pride that I might have. Tennessee into the Elite Eight, where I think UVA handles their business and moves on to the Final Four as the #1 overall seed. In the West here, this is another pretty tough region because I think this is the weakest 1 seed of all of them, and this is where I have my biggest upset going through. I have Xavier moving on to the first round. I also have Missouri with a freshly healthy Michael Porter Jr. moving on there. Then in this next matchup here, I have the South Dakota State Jackrabbits moving on over the Ohio State Buckeyes. I have them going pretty far, as you'll see in just a second. I have complete faith in this South Dakota State team. They cruised through the conference tournament, and I think they're a very skilled team. Then you have Gonzaga into the second round, then San Diego State as well. Then going through, you basically have chalk here, except for Providence moving on as the 10 seed over Texas A&M. Then looking into the second round, I have Xavier moving on to the Sweet 16, and I also, perhaps my biggest and boldest upset of the tournament, I have the South Dakota State Jackrabbits moving on over Gonzaga. Look, Gonzaga's a great team, but I think sometimes you just have to pick the team that you think is going to be the most magical one. I think South Dakota State is going to be my team in this one. Then you have Michigan moving on as the 3 seed into the Sweet 16. I really, really like the way this Michigan team is playing. Like I said before, you pick the hot teams in March, and Michigan is the hottest team after they cruise through the Big Ten tournament. Then you have UNC moving on in a pretty easy second-round game. After that, Xavier moving on to the Elite Eight over South Dakota State. I think that's pretty much the only reason why they get to the Elite Eight. If Gonzaga gets through to that game, I think Gonzaga could easily win that one. But because I have that upset pick there, I think South Dakota State's magical run ends there. Then in another bold upset, I have Michigan moving on over UNC. Michigan's a hot team. They're an incredibly skilled team. UNC is really good, but I think Michigan is going to be able to take that one. And then in the Elite Eight, the weakest 1 seed in the tournament going up against, I think, the strongest 3 seed. I have Michigan moving on to the Final Four. The Wolverines, I think this is their year to make a huge, huge run. I think they're going to do that with the win over Xavier in the Elite Eight. In the East here, it's another pretty tough region, but I ultimately think that this 1 seed in Villanova is really, really tough. I have Villanova moving on to the first round here. Then I have Alabama moving on there to face them as well. I think Alabama is a very hot team. Colin Sexton able to lead them to at least 1 win in this tournament. West Virginia moving on as well. Wichita State, the Shockers, always a pretty good team to pick in March. And I have Florida moving on here over St. Bonaventure. You know, I think Florida is one of those teams where they are able to avoid an upset. I think that's going to be a close one, but I think Florida ultimately does move on. Then I have Texas Tech moving on in the first round. People like to pick Texas Tech as a pretty popular team to get upset. I don't quite buy that. Butler, a perennially good March team, I think also moving on. Then also as the 2nd seed in this region, Purdue looking like a pretty strong team in March as well. Villanova I have moving on to the Sweet 16 at the top of the bracket in the second round. I have West Virginia also moving on. I think West Virginia is a very strong and deep team that should be able to get to that Sweet 16. Then also I'm going to have Texas Tech moving on over Florida. I think that's pretty much the only reason Texas Tech moves on is because they get to face a Florida team that maybe got a little bit of a scare from St. Bonaventure in the first round. Then I have Purdue moving on over Butler in another 2/10 second-round game. Villanova, I think, beats West Virginia in that Sweet 16. Villanova, still a really, really talented team. It's very similar to the way they were a couple years ago when they won it all. Then I have Texas Tech into the Elite Eight. I think Texas Tech might be able to surprise some people. I think a lot of people are counting them out, and a lot of times when you get counted out like that, that's the time when you go on a run. Then I have Villanova moving on in a fairly easy Elite Eight game, going on to the Final Four yet again. Here in the Midwest, Kansas is going to rule them all. People are talking about Penn as a first-round upset. Still not buying it too much. I have Seton Hall moving on over NC State as well. Clemson in the next game. And as a little bit of an upset here, I have Charleston moving on over Auburn. I think Auburn is one of the weaker SEC teams that got in. They didn't have a very strong end of the season. So I think Charleston is going to be the team that ultimately moves on and another big upset pick. TCU moving on in their first-round game as well. Going down the bracket, it's pretty much chalk from here. Michigan State also getting a win. And Rhode Island taking a game in the first round, as well as Duke. I think Duke is the strongest team in this region. Then you have Kansas moving on to the Sweet 16 over Seton Hall. I have Clemson moving on over Charleston. Charleston just not going to have the magic to make the run like South Dakota State will. Then I have Michigan State moving on as the 3 seed to face off against Duke, which I think will be one of the marquee matchups of the tournament in the Sweet 16. Up top, I have Kansas moving on over Clemson. I think they're a very dominant team that should be an Elite 8 team. If there aren't, then there's something wrong here. Then I think Duke moves on in the Sweet 16 as well. They're one of the deeper teams in this tournament. I think they're going to make a big run. And then I have Duke beating Kansas to move on to the Final Four. I think Grayson Allen and this Duke team is just too strong not to make it to the Final Four. In the Final Four here in the first matchup, UVA just far too strong for Michigan, too strong defensively. They can be so suffocating as we saw earlier on in the year. I think UVA moves on to the championship game. I also think Duke moves on over Villanova. Like I said, they're a very deep team. They have a lot of strong players. I think they are able to outshoot Villanova and out-rebound and outplay them to move on to the championship game. And in this championship game, it's a tough matchup here. The way you beat UVA is you just rain threes on them. You become a team of sharpshooters. And I don't think Duke is the team cut out to do that, especially if they beat Villanova into that game. I take UVA to win it all here. It's a pretty boring pick, I know, taking the #1 overall seed to win it. But I just think they're too strong defensively. They play a really tough brand of basketball, and that'll ride them ultimately to a title.
All right, let's take a look at the South region of this bracket. For me personally, in my bracket, the South is the most exciting because I have the most upsets picked here. But I still think that that UVA team has such strong defense and such good senior leadership that they're going to be the ones to make it out. But let's take a look at the first round. We've got UVA advancing. We've got Creighton advancing. Nothing too crazy there. This is one of my favorite picks of the entire bracket. I've got Davidson over Kentucky. I think Peyton Aldridge is a stud of a senior. I think that Kentucky is a team that during some of their bigger games in the regular season, they got a little flustered. I'm going to take the execution of Davidson over the pure athleticism of Kentucky. Next, I've got Arizona over Buffalo. Arizona, DeAndre Ayton. That's enough said. Loyola Chicago has been a really popular upset pick over Miami. I think when you look at a team like Loyola Chicago, they hold their opponents to about 62 points a game. They've got stellar defense. They crash the boards. That sets a team up really well in March Madness. So I'm going to go ahead and pick them over Miami. Next, Tennessee. I have them moving on as well. Again, Grant Williams, just a stud of a person. You see him playing. He looks like a linebacker on the court. Tennessee advancing in that game. Texas over Nevada is a pick that I have because Nevada is a team that really struggled against teams that had a little bit more length. They went 0-2 against San Diego State. San Diego State's a team that had a lot of length, really good at guarding the perimeter, helped deter some of their really strong shooting. So I have Texas going ahead and advancing over Nevada. And Cincinnati, that's just a pretty easy pick. I just have chalk on that one. Now moving on, UVA over Creighton. Again, pretty easy pick. UVA, really stellar defense. Davidson, I have them beating Kentucky, but again, DeAndre Ayton's a stud of a player. I have them going on over Davidson. Tennessee, again, Grant Williams, that really good three-point shooting. I don't think Loyola Chicago has it in them to keep up with that Tennessee team. And Cincinnati advancing on. Now when we get to this round, we're taking a look at UVA and Arizona. UVA's defense is really, really good, and I think that they're going to be really good at taking away DeAndre Ayton by doubling him down. And I don't think that Arizona has a player that can take advantage of that double. So I've got UVA moving on in what's going to be an inevitably tough game against Arizona. And next we've got Tennessee moving on over Cincinnati. Cincinnati's got a stellar defense, but I think a team's inevitably going to figure out how to score on them. And that's got to be Tennessee with the really physical players and with their really good three-point shooting. I see Tennessee moving on. And then UVA against Tennessee. Again, I just see that UVA defense being able to take away the strength of Tennessee. I've got UVA moving on to my Final Four out of the South. All right, my west side of the bracket is a little bit less exciting, but still have some really interesting upset picks for you. Xavier as the #1 seed is really interesting when you think about them because they're probably the least hyped up #1 seed. A lot of people don't have a lot of confidence in them. I don't see them getting out early, but I also don't have confidence in them to make it out of the West region. So I've got Xavier winning their first game. I've got Mizzou and Michael Porter Jr. winning their first game. OSU is a team that depends a lot on size, and South Dakota State and Mike Daum have the size to try and combat that, and Mike Daum's such a good scorer. I see South Dakota State being a real darling in this classic 12-5 matchup, so I have South Dakota State moving on. Gonzaga is one of my favorite teams, mostly because of Killian Tilly and their versatile big men. So I've got Gonzaga moving on from this game, and Gonzaga is the team that I have moving really far in the West bracket. Next, I've got Houston over San Diego State. Michigan. Michigan's a team that's been incredibly hot lately. They had an incredibly elite defense. In their last 9 games, they had a top 10 offense. So you have that elite defense and that elite offense. I have Michigan State going far, getting out of the first round pretty easy. Providence over Texas A&M is a really interesting game, and for me, it just comes down to guard play. I think Providence has really veteran guards. I think Texas A&M has inconsistent guard play, and when it comes to March Madness, I'm taking senior guards over inconsistent guards every single time. So I have Providence moving on, and then UNC is UNC. So I've got UNC and Joel Berry moving on. I think Joel Berry is undefeated, or he only has 1 loss in his numerous starts in the first round of March Madness games. So moving on, I have Xavier beating Mizzou. Mizzou's a really interesting team because Michael Porter Jr., if he gets his legs underneath him against Florida State, could put up a challenge for Xavier, but I think Xavier's going to go ahead and move on past them. South Dakota State, really interesting team. The Jackrabbits are a really fun mascot, but I think Gonzaga has too much firepower. I think their big men are too versatile to really do any damage against Gonzaga, so Gonzaga's going to go ahead and move on from that game. Michigan, again, really big powerhouse team. UNC powerhouse team. A lot of chalk moving on from this round. Now moving on, Xavier Gonzaga. This is where I see Xavier's going to have a really big challenge. Again, Killian Tilly. He's a big man who can guard the perimeter. He's a big man who plays in the post. He's a big man who shoots over 50% from 3. Killian Tilly is going to be the difference maker for Gonzaga this entire tournament. You heard it here. Next, Michigan over UNC. This is going to be a really tough game, but I think Michigan has the size and Michigan has the tools to beat UNC. Again, they're already an incredibly impressive defensive team, and with how hot they've been on offense, I have Michigan upsetting UNC. And then Gonzaga, Michigan, I think that Gonzaga has the tools and those versatile big men to really combat Michigan's strength. And I'd have Gonzaga moving on to the Final Four to beat Michigan in this round. All right, the East is a fairly boring part of the bracket for me. I've got pretty much all chalk going through. Villanova's the one team that I think is prepared to make it out of the East. I think they're really not going to face a challenge at any point in this bracket. One of the bigger picks that I have is West Virginia over Wichita State. I think that West Virginia is a team that can really take advantage of some of Wichita State's really soft defense. So I've got all chalk moving on. Then I've got Wichita State losing to West Virginia. Texas Tech's a really interesting team because they have really good defense, but they seem to live and die through Keenan Evans. So I think that if they get past SF Austin, they're going to be okay moving on the rest of this bracket. But that first game is going to be pretty challenging for them, but I still have them moving on. Now, looking at these games for Villanova against West Virginia and Texas Tech against Purdue, I think that Texas Tech's defense is what's going to be a really big separator in this game. I think that they're really good at slowing the game down, playing in the half court. So I've got Texas Tech moving on and beating Purdue. And Villanova against West Virginia, also known as Press Virginia. I think that Villanova has the senior guard play to be able to avoid the press. I think West Virginia gets tired out in the first 30 minutes or so of that game, and Villanova is able to win it handily after that. And then again, I think that senior guard play is really going to make a difference when it comes down to a slow, gritty half-court game. So I've got Villanova taking it over Texas Tech to move on to the Final Four. All right, the Midwest has some really interesting teams, and it has one of my favorite teams, one of a lot of people's favorite teams in Michigan State. And I think Michigan State can go really, really far, and I think inevitably they're going to be the ones to come out of the Midwest. Going through the first round of games, though, I have Kansas winning, nothing too crazy there. Seton Hall got chalked there. New Mexico State is a team that I'm really excited about. I think New Mexico State can be the darling in this region. They crash the boards really well. They've got very good guard play. I think New Mexico State is my darling out of this part of the bracket. I have them even advancing over Auburn in the next round as well. Auburn over Charleston, again, I got chalk there. TCU, I have chalk there. Michigan State has one of the nastiest front lines in this entire tournament. Oklahoma is a really interesting pick because a lot of people think that they shouldn't have been in the tournament. But I think that Trae Young, keeping in mind that this is probably the only tournament he's going to get to play in, I think that he just puts on a show. I'm really betting on Trae Young and the Oklahoma Sooners to win this game. And then Duke over Iona, I've got chalk there again. So now moving back to the top of this, Kansas over Seton Hall. Seton Hall does present a lot of challenges for Kansas, especially because Kansas does like to play small. But I think that Kansas should win this game pretty handily. Now, Auburn is a team that a lot of people thought was way overseeded. So I think that New Mexico State really continues their darling run. They take advantage of this, and they go ahead and they beat Auburn as well. TCU really doesn't pose a challenge for Michigan State in this game. Again, I think that just the way Michigan State is built with their massive front line, they have a lot of size. They crash boards like no other team, so I see them moving on as well. and then Duke going ahead and beating Oklahoma. I think that Trae Young has magic for one game, but I don't think that his magic is enough to cover them over the entire Duke team. Kansas over New Mexico State, I feel like this round is where you see a lot of double-digit seeds start to fall off, and I think that experience of Kansas is going to beat the darling of New Mexico State. Michigan State, Duke. This is one of the toughest games to pick in this entire side of the bracket. But I think that Michigan State has really good tools to go ahead and beat Duke. I think they've got really good guard play to combat the zone that Duke runs, and I think that they have a really good three-point shooting as well to combat that same zone. Michigan State did lose to Duke when they played in November, but Michigan State also shot 9 of 25 from behind the arc, so I don't think that happens again. I think Michigan State is able to pull it out and upset Duke in this game. And then finally, Kansas, Michigan State. Kansas is a team that notoriously runs very small, but Michigan State is the one team that has the size and has the offensive rebounding prowess to really make them pay for that. So I have Michigan State coming out on top of Kansas. All right, Final Four. Let's get started with UVA versus Gonzaga. This is going to be a really interesting matchup, but a matchup that I think is going to be really impacted by the fact that DeAndre Hunter just broke his wrist. He was an amazing talent coming off the bench, a candidate for Sixth Man of the Year, and I think that Gonzaga is really going to be able to take advantage of that, especially with how versatile their big men are. And I've been harping on this, but they're able to play in the post, they can shoot mid-range, they can shoot the three. I think that that injury, combined with how proficient Hachimura is off the bench for Gonzaga, is going to be able to lift them and get them the win over UVA. Next, Villanova, Michigan State. Michigan State has one of the best athletic teams in this entire tournament. But I think that Villanova is suited perfectly to match up with them. Jalen Brunson and Mikal Bridges are perfectly suited to match up with this Michigan State team, and I think that Michigan State's run ends here at the hands of the Villanova. And moving on, Gonzaga-Villanova. A lot of people would think that Villanova would win this game, but I think that Gonzaga's big men and the way that they've been able to be used throughout the season is going to be the difference maker here, especially when you're taking a look at the one seeds walking into this game. If you had to choose the one seeds or the field, I think a lot of people would be tempted to choose the field. And I think Gonzaga is going to be the team from the field to be not the Cinderella, but the team that's going to be able to win over a one seed. So I've got Gonzaga winning the entire tournament in this round. All right, that's all the time that we have for today's show. My name is Drew Sundaram, and for Cutler Klein and Max Schneider, we're signing off. Happy March Madness, and we'll see you next week.